5 months into 1942, on a Tokyo war planning map, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto draws a line around the world. The line is a sub, 400 feet long, and inside its hull, 3 aircraft sleep. It is the longest thesis anyone in the Imperial Japanese Navy will ever write. The boat on that line will be, when it is finally launched, the largest submarine ever built. And it will still be the largest when the Americans pick her off the sea in the summer of 1945. This is the story of why it was Japan's biggest mistake. The tide beginning. In the first 18 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy did something no other navy in modern history had ever managed to do. It moved an ocean. From Truk Lagoon in the Carolines, from Rabaul on New Britain, from the great anchorage at Palau, the Tokyo Express carried men and materiel by night, and by day, the long-range I-boats, Type 2, Type 3, the RO class, strangled the Allied perimeter from below the surface. By the middle of 1942, Japan's submarine fleet had cut sea lanes from Guam to Sydney to Wellington. American radar of that period could not yet catch a U-boat hugging the thermocline. Allied aircraft could not reach them at periscope depth. The destroyers escorting Australian troop convoys had not yet learned to depth charge in pairs. There was, briefly, a feeling in Tokyo that the war could be outlasted, that the patience of the democracies would give up before the patience of Japan's captains. To listen to a senior naval officer in the autumn of 1942 was to listen to a man talking about range the way a doctor talks about blood. Range was the diagnosis. Range was the cure. The Japanese surface fleet, he would say, does not need to win every battle. It only needs to outlast yours. And the patient, in 1942, was America. It was into that confidence that Yamamoto drew his line. Not a new battleship. Not a new carrier. An underwater airfield. A single hull, 400 feet long, capable of carrying 3 attack aircraft across any ocean on Earth and releasing them at an enemy coast without warning. Submitted to the Imperial General Staff in early September of 1942, the brief was unambiguous. Build it long enough to outrange anything afloat. Build it large enough to carry the air group we will need. Make the ocean do what the carriers had begun, in 1942, no longer to be able to do. You do not fight Japan in 1942 the way it wants to be fought. And the Japanese Navy, at the moment of the brief, knew it. 400 feet. At Kure Naval Yard, the engineering team took the brief and did what the brief asked. They built it 400 feet long. They built it, by some margin, longer than the flight deck of an American cruiser escort. They installed a cylindrical aircraft hangar, 30 meters long, 3 decks tall, ringed into the hull forward of the conning tower, like a cargo hold designed for a single species of lever. They installed a forward-facing steam catapult on the forward deck, a flying-off ramp strong enough to push a small aircraft into a working headwind off the bow. They rode the boat's flood tank logic in reverse, pumping seawater between the saddle and the trim tanks, to hold the hull steady in the trough between swells, so the catapult could fire on a sea state most submarines would not have surfaced in. Surface displacement was 5,223 tons. Submerged, the boat was 6,560 tons. The pressure hull went down to a working depth of about 650 feet. There had never been a submarine of this size. There would not be again until the nuclear attack submarines of the 1960s. The first hull, I-400, was laid down at Kure in 1942. By late 1944, I-400 was launched. I-401 and I-402 rose beside her in the building dock. The crews who walked the unfinished hangar ring in the spring of 1944 reported to their officers, by letter, that they had stood inside the largest enclosed space afloat in the Japanese Navy and had felt they were looking at a coffin propped open by specialists. 5 hulls were ordered. 3 would be completed. But before any of them reached the open Pacific, the brief had to be matched to an aircraft nobody had yet built. Clear Sky Storm. The boat needed an aircraft nobody had yet built. The aircraft was called Submarine, written with two characters that read in English as Clear Sky Storm. Its design cell at WWII drew it small, and they drew it to fold. Wings folded against the fuselage. The two floats retracted inward toward the center line. The whole assembly drew down to a stowage length of just over 30 feet and a wingspan of 12. Tipped on its tail, it could be lashed upright against the ring of the hangar with two companions and a built-in catapult trolley beneath it. Its top speed, once airborne, was 295 miles an hour. Its combat radius was 740 miles, more than enough to reach a city on an enemy coast, drop a 500-kilogram bomb, set the return course for the mothership, and recover at sea by means nobody in Japan had yet been able to test in combat. Inside an I-400 class hangar, the geometry of war changed. 3 aircraft, disassembled for stowage, lashed upright to the deck ring, like torpedoes standing on their noses. A crew of 12 men could prepare a single Submarine for launch in 30 minutes. That is, in industrial terms, an extraordinary achievement for a 5,000-ton boat pitching in a seaway. It is also, in combat terms, a confession. 30 minutes, in combat, is 2 waves of inbound American air you no longer have time to spend. 30 minutes is the difference between a weapon platform and a target. Lifted from the hangar onto the catapult by a forward-mounted crane, the Submarine needed only 1 push. There is wartime footage of this. A white sea, a low sun on the rail, a single Submarine, dirty green, on a rolling deck. The catapult fires. The aircraft leaves the boat as if from a runway, and not an ocean. The launching officer on the forward deck, in calm weather, would step back from the catapult bar as if from a gun. In any other weather, he stayed out of the boat entirely. But the men who would fly those sirens were not, in 1944, the men the boat had been designed around. They were a peculiar cross-section of the Japanese Naval Aviation Branch, submariners in borrowed flying uniforms, drawn from training programs that had been cut short as fuel dried up across the home islands. They would answer, in May of 1945, to an embarked air group commander whose name is recorded as Tabata, and they would carry, in their kit, the unspoken understanding that aircraft take more than 30 minutes to be ready, and the sea takes less than 30 seconds to take a man. Their training logs, recovered at Submarine 6 weeks after the surrender, showed fewer than 30 hours of dive bombing practice apiece. 3 Yamamoto had asked for 18 Sentoku in 1942. The Imperial General Staff approved the order without revision. The boats were to be split, 9 for the Pacific, 9 for an Atlantic strike against the Panama Canal. 5 were laid down. 3 were completed as designed. The reason was not engineering. The reason was Midway. Midway wiped out 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single morning in June of 1942. 68,000 tons of flight deck sent to the bottom in 90 minutes. In the days that followed, every dry dock in every shipyard in Japan was redirected to fleet carrier replacements. The Sentoku, magnificent as they were, dropped to second priority in a single afternoon. They did not stop being built. They simply stopped being promised. The 18 became 13. The 13 became 5. The 5 became 3. This is the first fault line in the story. Japan built a long-range submarine bomber, a strategic weapon, on a shipbuilding budget sized for a tactical navy. The boat was supposed to deliver a single hammer blow at the start of a long war. By the time the war was half done, the war was already a different war. A war of attrition, a war of logistics, a war in which the home islands were running, by August 1945, on a fraction of the oil they had begun with. A war in which a 5,000-ton boat with 3 aircraft in its hangar was being held at the pier at Kure by the same rationing that had kept its pilots from practicing dive bombing in open ocean. The locks of Panama. The plan to strike the Panama Canal locks was written into Yamamoto's thesis in 1942, when the locks were heavy iron, and concrete poured in 1914. By 1943, the locks had been hardened. The Americans understood, by the beginning of 1943, what Yamamoto had understood at the end of 1942, that a long-range Japanese bomber existed in the planning, and that the canal was its target. By 1944, the Atlantic approach was filmed by PBYs flying daylight patrols. By 1945, the locks were sheathed, and the canal was patrolled by escort carriers out of Ceylon. The plan inside Yamamoto's 400-foot thesis was 6 years old before the boat was even finished. It was killed by silence, not by a single order, by the slow hardening of every fact it depended on. In May of 1945, the surviving Sentoku, I-401 and her sisters, were combined into Operation Hikari, the only remaining strategic concept still inside reach of a working hull. They turned south. They turned toward Ulithi Atoll, the great staging anchorage of the United States Fifth Fleet. 472 ships lay there in preparation for the invasion of Okinawa. The proposal, written by the Sixth Fleet staff under Vice Admiral Miwa, was to surface off Ulithi in the dead of night, unfold 3 sirens out of the hangar, launch them from the catapult under cover of darkness, recover them on the surface at first light, dive, and be gone before the carrier air group could intercept. 3 aircraft, 3 anchorages, 3 tide positions in the same 72-hour window. But the pilots who were to fly those sirens, the embarked air group under Lieutenant Commander Tabata, had never practiced dive bombing over open ocean. They had practiced, mostly, at night in calm bays. They had never released a 500-kilogram bomb from a Seiron in any condition resembling combat. They had never, by their own admission at the post-war interrogation, run a live bombing run in rough water. They would have, perhaps, 1 sortie each, 3 sirens, 3 targets, 3 rescue positions, at sea, at night, in waters patrolled by PT boats carrying the new surface search radar that had detected every surfaced German U-boat in the Atlantic in 1944. By May of 1945, the United States Fifth Fleet had wired Ulithi itself. Radar picket boats covered the seaward approaches around the clock. PBYs flew dawn and dusk sweeps out to 200 miles. An anchorage of 472 ships was the most alerted patch of ocean on Earth. To surface inside her waters and unfold 3 aircraft on a rolling deck between midnight and first light would have been to surface in front of a cage that was already designed. It was a heroic mission. It was a deliverable. It was on a schedule no crew on Earth could have met. Hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is the largest submarine ever built surrendering to a sonar operator who has just been told he owns the boat. Do not go anywhere. 2 waves. In July of 1945, I-401 was ordered out of Kure. She carried 3 sirens in her hangar. She carried fuel for the round trip and a half. Enough, by the engineer's calculation, for the full operation and a return to a Japanese home island with a margin of safety. She carried a captain, Captain Toshio Kusaka, who knew by then what the war had become. The boat was forced to wait, day after day, off the Kure coast, for weather windows that never quite arrived. Each morning, fuel burned in the waiting. Each morning, the air over the inland sea carried more Allied fighters than the day before. By the second week of August, fuel allocations to the Imperial Japanese Navy had collapsed below combat minimums. The fuel I-401 carried was not cut off by Admiral Kusaka, but by the oil shortage of the home islands themselves. The boat, with 3 aircraft in her hangar, was never within 200 miles of firing a catapult. He did not yet know that his aircraft would remain bolted inside the hangar. On the 15th of August, the order came from Tokyo. The Emperor had announced surrender. I-401 turned east. She ran, on fumes, to an anchorage off the Boso Peninsula. The crew, in defiance of the standing scuttle order, disassembled her aircraft on the surface and stripped the catapult for sundry reasons. Fuel, the captain's notes show, was too low to fire the catapult even once. The sirens never left the hangar ring. The hangar ring never left the ship. The ship itself crossed the Pacific as a hull, never as a weapon. Day of surrender. On the morning of 29 August 1945, the American submarine USS Segundo made sonar contact off the entrance to Sagami Bay. The contact was enormous. It ran deeper than the echoes of a fleet escort. The return ping, recorded in the sonar room at 11:08 hours, was wider than anything in the watch officer's notebook. Commander Joseph Will of the Segundo transmitted surrender terms to a Japanese emissary boat, and the emissary led the American boarding party to Sagami One. The American boarding party did not yet know what they were about to see. They were shown down a deck, through a forward hatch, and into a cylindrical room, the hangar ring, where 3 sirens sat lashed upright and intact. Each aircraft looked new. Each aircraft still carried the shipping tape on its cockpit rails from the assembly cell at Aichi. Each aircraft, had it been launched at any time in the previous year, would have arrived at any American-held anchorage with enough fuel for a one-way dive bomb run and a return at sea that would not have been possible. The man who had missed the war by minutes was not, in this case, the pilot. He was the boat. The boat was a masterwork. The war was over. Commander Will's boarding report, written within 48 hours, included a single drawing of a hangar ring, 3 cross-sections in circle, and the most understated sentence in the post-war U.S. Navy inventory of handoffs. It read, in part, that the boarding officers were shown equipment of a kind not previously captured from any Navy. 10,000 feet, she was not sunk in Sagami Bay. The Soviets, by early 1946, were rumored to be interested in the type. The United States, by direction of the Joint Chiefs, took possession and ordered a destruction that was to be documented. The boat was towed, stern first, halfway across the Pacific on the surface, a 400-foot hull towed on a hawser by an escort tug out of Yokosuka so that she could be sunk under American control, in American water, at American depth. On the 31st of May, 1946, the submarine USS Trumpetfish put 2 dummy exercise torpedoes into I-400's hull off the south coast of Oahu, at Kalaeloa. I-400 took water by the bow. She slid. She went down. The senior observer aboard the Trumpetfish reported, by radio, that the boat had begun her descent in a bow-down attitude and had not recovered. On an Oahu beach 10,000 feet below, a 1,000-pound torpedo slid toward the largest object ever built to drown. 10,000 feet of water closed over the hangar. 10,000 feet of water closed over the 3 Searans that had never flown. 10,000 feet of water closed over the work of the men at Aichi, the men at Kure, the men at Yokohama, and the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Submarine Corps, who had built, by 1945, the most extraordinary weapon on Earth, and arrived at the moment of its use 6 years too late. The wreck of I-400 was rediscovered by the University of Hawaii in 2005, intact, the hangar still recognizable on the side scan record. The submarine that was never a weapon lasted longer than the war she was built to survive. The largest submarine ever built was a casualty of doctrine, not engineering. Japan did not lose the Pacific because Yamamoto lacked range. Japan lost the Pacific because, by the time the Sentoku surfaced off an enemy coast, the enemy had wired that coast for radar, hardened its locks, and put carriers inside every harbor the Seiran was supposed to surprise. The boat, 400 feet of national will, was useless against the only enemy that mattered in 1945, time. It is the great paradox of Imperial Japanese naval doctrine that the closer the empire's engineers drew to a wonder weapon, the farther its commanders drew from a winnable war. Remember that detail from the first chapter, Yamamoto's line around the world? Here is where it stops mattering. A wonder weapon at war's end is a confession of defeat. And so the largest submarine ever built, larger than anything afloat in 1945, capable of carrying 3 aircraft across any ocean, engineered to a precision no imperial naval architect had ever reached before, sank in deep water off Oahu in 1946, 3 days before the Soviets asked for the keys. The wonder was a coffin. The coffin was the war. The war was over. This is the story of why Japan's giant submarine was its biggest mistake. Subscribe, ring the bell, and every week we tell you how America actually won its war. Tap like. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and we will see you in the next one.